I feel I'm disappointed. Many times I feel I'm all alone. But my blessed Jesus keep me going. I don't know how the rest goes. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. My grandfather, Peter Kern, was born and raised in Erie, Pennsylvania. And so during the gold rush days, turn of the century, he came up to the pass and came up north to Alaska. And then he settled here in Golovin, Bluff, and probably in Nome. When he came up here, I don't recall him saying that he had staked claims at the time when everybody came up here for the gold and staking claims. But he did labor. He was on the ditch line, watching the ditch lines where they had water to mine with, Bluff area, and I'm very sure probably in Nome too. So he was more of a trader. He often talked about when he acquired a dog team during the winter, how he hunted ptarmigan and sold them to the miners and probably other animals. So from that, he fell in love with a native lady which was from the Fish River tribe. Her name was Dora. I don't remember her father, but I'm sure it was Mayugan, because she named her son Pete Kern Jr. Mayugan, which was the youngest of their 3 children. The oldest was Minnie Fagerstrom, my mother, and then I had an aunt named Maggie. So from then on, after he got married to this native lady, he started carrying the mail team. He became a mail carrier with a dog team. But my grandmother on the father's side, her name was Susan, and her father was from Rocky Point area, that settlement there, and his name was Kaugok. So I named our youngest boy Kaugok, which was Emo. And they had him and Charlie Fagerstrom, which was my grandfather on the father's side, a Swede, had married also a native lady. And they had Margaret, Anne, Ruth, the daughters, and the brothers were John Fagerstrom, which was my father, and Charlie Fagerstrom, my uncle. And that was his family. I was born here in Golovin, March 9, 1926, to John Fagerstrom and Minnie Kern. They had gotten married at council in the I should have looked up then I was the 4th child of 12. I had 2 older brothers and an older sister, and their names were Ernie Berg, which was adopted to my aunt, then Floyd Fagerstrom, Myrtle Fagerstrom, and I myself, Maggie. Then after me there was 8 more. So when I was 3 months old, then my grandfather took me and raised me there at Solomon, where he had a roadhouse and a store. And also there was a ferry on Bonanza River, which he also took care of, but when my Uncle Pete got older, he took over that one. Because by the time my grandfather took me, he was in his early 60s. And my real grandmother was still alive then, whose name was Dora. And when, just before I was 2 years old, she passed away. So then my grandfather remarried another native lady, which was also from Fish River. And then they had a daughter named Ruth, which was 4 years older than I was. And we lived in Solomon then. I grew up with my Uncle Pete, Ruth, and my step-grandmother, which I called Mom. And she's been like a mom to me ever since I was a child. And Uncle Pete married a lady that my step-grandmother's daughter. And they also had some children. But in those days, there was a lot of infant deaths, and they lost 4 little boys. And Betty, my cousin, survived, and also 2 more boys. And they had adopted a son from Nome, so they raised 4 children. My grandfather had called my mother on the phone from Solomon. At that time they had a landline with telephones from Nome to Safety, from Safety to Solomon, from Solomon to Bluff, then to White Mountain, and to here to Gullivan. That as far as the telephone line went. So my grandfather called my mother that if she could come over to Solomon to tend to the store what he was running. Peter Kern General Store was the name. And so my mother got ready, and our dad with a dog team, when the day the mail boat was supposed to beach over by Little Rocky, because the inner bay still had ice, they went across with my father driving the dog team, my mother, Floyd, Merle, and I. I was only going on 3 months old, probably, which was latter part of May, before the ice went out. So the first day we went across there, the mail boat never showed. So, of course, me being just a baby, don't know all this, don't remember all this, but that's what my mother and my father had told me. Years later, when I went to see them in Nome, by then my dad was an invalid and my mother was taking care of him. But going back to that day, we came back the first day for first evening, and next morning we went across again to Little Rocky. And the mailboat arrived. So we got on board the mailboat. Of course, my dad with his team came back here to Gullivan. And we continued on to Solomon, where my grandfather was running his store. And when we got there, after a few days, he told my mother he had changed his mind going outside on the Alaska steamship. That was the reason why he had wanted her to come over to run the store while he was gone. And so, when he changed his mind, after a few days, my mother was getting ready to come back to Gullivan from Solomon on the same boat, mailboat. And when she was getting ready, my grandfather said to her, "You leave the baby here." And of course he was in his early 60s, and apparently my grandmother, Dora, Kayoktorok is her Eskimo name, she was a little older than my grandfather. And so Minnie, my mother, went to her and asked her, will you be able to take care of this baby? And all my grandmother answer was to her daughter then, well, your papa sure wants her. Papa with Inupiaq. So she ended up leaving me there, and I was now with my grandparents, her parents. And I grew up with that couple, my grandparents, Peter Kern and Dora. And in 1927, in December, I think it is, if the date's right, she died and left me, of course, with just Uncle Pete, who was living with my grandfather, helping him out in the store and also taking care of the ferry in the summertime. There was a ferry at Bonanza. And my grandfather, there was only 3 of us left in the household. And when my grandmother died, my mother, Minnie, came over with a dog team to take me back. I'm sure she felt bad that I was just a little girl, not quite 2 years old, to have me live with my grandfather, and probably she was worried about my grandfather raising a baby, you know, just a toddler. But, you know, by then he was so attached to me, and I'm sure I was, that when she was getting ready to leave and was looking for me, my grandfather had hid me in the dark room with a bag of candy. And that's what, you know, down through the years when I was able to understand people, these elders would come, you know, see us at Solomon and look at me and would say those same words. A lot of people, elders did. So this is the little girl that the grandfather hid in a dark room with a bag of candy. So that was said to me so many times, I, you know, just memorized it. So my mother, of course, probably realized how her dad was so attached to me that by then that she left without me. But the story I heard, or my father really, when he brought that up, he was an invalid now. When I went to Nome, here both my grandparents were gone now. My step-grandmother I learned to call, you know, that I called Mom. My grandfather had remarried. Both of them gave me the true story of how I ended up at Solomon. My father said when my mother came back without me, he was kind of hurt. But then he said to himself, well, she'll have a good home and she won't be hungry. That, you know, and then I really admired how he said it. She'll have a good home and she won't be hungry. You know, we as parents, we're always concerned about having our children have food to eat. And when he said that, we'll never forget that. Because they ended up, after I was left at my grandparents', I'm sure my mother sometimes may have regretted. But I'm thankful, though, you know, that I was raised by my grandparents, so, because I learned a lot of subsistence. And after me, there was 8 more children they have. And I understand fully what my dad had said. She won't go hungry. And from then on, I understand, especially after I got married and got older and had my own children. But you know, during my adolescent years, I used to think, why did they have to give me away out of 12. You know, when you're trying to change from youth to adult, there's a lot of questions you have. The big question I always had was why. But later years, especially after I got married, I think I would say something, and Martin said to me, he was also adopted by his grandparents, or raised by his grandparents. I never forgot what he said to me. You are our chosen daughter. That's what he said to me, that, you know, don't have pity for yourself, or you are a chosen daughter. And that, you know, really made me see that I was really a chosen daughter by my grandfather. My earliest memories was when I was growing up there in Solomon. Since my grandfather, by then my Uncle Pete, was now a mail carrier with a dog team of dogs. And every summer when the fish came in, they would go seining in Bonanza River, even in Solomon River, for salmon, because the salmon came in first in the springtime when the fish came in. And then after the salmon would be the humpbacks. But I don't recall getting them so many silvers. So every good day when it's not raining, the chore was for my uncle, his wife Clara, and Ruth, and also there was a daughter, my grandmother's daughter, had moved over to Solomon with how many kids of hers? There was Helen, Anne, Hilda, Isaac, and Virginia. Their father had died from TB at White Mountain, so since they lost their provider, their dad, they moved to Solomon to be closer to her mother, my grandmother, that raised me, who I called Mom. And with them, then Uncle Pete, and also a friend of Uncle Pete's, Pete Dalila, they would go seining and get a boatload of fish. Of course, those days too, there was no commercial fishing, so they could hang all the fish they can get, and there was plenty of them. And the fish they hung was to feed the mail team, the dogs that Uncle Pete used to carry the mail. And sometimes, you know, there's not enough fish. It's not always plentiful. So in the fall time, just before freeze-up, when the tomcods came into either Solomon River or Bonanza River, they would seine a boatload of tomcods. And by then they would have eggs and very full, and sack them in gunny sacks, and that's what they also use for dog feed. And when they fed the dogs, they would have to have blubber to go with the dry fish because it was so dry. And in the fall time, Uncle Pete would set whale net a few miles east of Solomon, and this would be before freeze-up, probably month of September. And I remember sometimes he would drag home one or two at a time whale, beluga whale. And there was a big building, a Billy Rose building down by the riverside at the Solomon River. And after they butchered the beluga, they would hang the blubber like slabs of bacon in this big warehouse on nails or hooks. And all during the summer months, when the dogs were not, you know, tied up. There was a row of dogs in this, like a little, where the railroad track was, when the railroad was still operating those days, before I can even remember. And they had empty drums for their dog houses, and tied up. And right in the middle, every day my grandfather would walk down and cook a big pot of dog feed with fish heads and the backbones, and of course the intestines of the guts of the fish. And then he would thicken it with cornmeal. I can still see the cornmeal bubbling. That's the reason why I never did like cornmeal as a cooked cereal in the mornings. I could just picture that big tub or half a drum of fish heads and all the stuff in there, boiling with this cornmeal to thicken it. That was Papa's chore all summer long. There was in that picture of Papa's team, we have counted 26 dogs. And in that article of Uncle Pete's, I think he said 28, somewhere in there, because they had to have a oversized sled that would carry 1,000 pounds of mail. And my Uncle Pete, when he ran the team, I think he started in November, just as soon as the rivers were safe to travel and cross. And that went on till month of May. It also would depend on how the breakup was. If it was early, they would have to quit early. And from Solomon, when he started, he went to Nome first. And from Nome, he worked his way down, I think, to Isaac's Point. Somebody apparently would meet him there from the other direction and exchange their load. And because, if I remember right, Uncle Pete took 2 weeks to make the round trip, hitting each village. And other times, sometimes he would have a passenger he carried from village to village. You know, Uncle Pete was coming, people would be hollering, "Mail team! Mail team!" And the dog team trail would be just trodden down because most of the people were traveling by dog team. And then it snowed, or the dogs knew exactly, they know the trail, and they would follow that trail. Hardly got lost, unless the driver forced them to turn one way or the other. He would take the mail to White Mountain or Council, because when the mail team from Bluff, they came here, they didn't go through White Mountain. From Solomon to Safety and Nome. Then spend the night in Nome, then comes back to Safety, and then to Solomon, spend the night. And from Solomon he goes to Bluff, Golovin, Elam, Isaac's Point. I think that's his route. Then from Isaac's Point back to Elam. I don't think they went through Coyle. I may be wrong. And during the winter then, of course, even when my grandmother started driving dogs to go squirrel hunting and haul ice, because there was no running water at Solomon. My grandmother, before Ruth was old enough to go haul ice for drinking water from the river, Solomon River, we still had to have dogs for traveling, or to go to conferences by dog team in the winter time. These church conferences were held each year in a different village, and it was between Inupiaq and White Mountain. Each year it was a different place. And Mama went to those conferences every year. It was, I think, the last Thursday of March they would go. And if she was going to Inupiaq for the conference, she would have to leave one whole week, because each night, each day they traveled one day to another village. From Solomon, she would have to go to White Mountain. From White Mountain, then she went on to Golovin. From Golovin to Elam. From Elam to Isaac's Point. From Isaac's Point, then to Shaktoolik. From Shaktoolik down to Inupiaq. So that took about a week. Same way coming home. They had to take the same route. Of course, it depended on weather too. But, those memories are still, at my age I'm starting to forget, but I still can remember them so well. School didn't start in Solomon. BI didn't start up a school there till I was 9 years old, which would have been 1935. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and there was a couple middle-aged, Mr. and Mrs. Nyland. Mabel Nyland, the wife, was a teacher, and her husband, that was Andy Nyland, he was our janitor. There was probably only little over 10, maybe not more than 15 of us students there. The older ones were almost in their late teens when the school started. But, we as, village kids there, we spoke nothing but Eskimo. I spoke English. We did speak English, when we needed to, because my grandfather was Irishman, and we had to talk to him in English. But when I went to school at that age, speaking fluent Eskimo, when it came to solve problems, it was you read the problem, but you had the tendency to think in Eskimo to try to figure it out. I remember my classmate and I, Russell Tutkayal was his name. One morning we went to school and there was a problem in our math book. It said, a pint a pound the world around. We had the heart, we couldn't figure out. Here it was so plain, a pint a pound the world around, which mean a pint was a pound. And the question was, if there is 4 quarts to a gallon, how much will 5 gallons weigh? So since we couldn't solve that problem, we asked our teacher, Mrs. Nyland, and she explained pint a pound, I used to be able to figure that out right now, but after I found out what it meant. But pint a pound, you end up, I'm not going to detail it, you end up with 5 gallons is 40 pounds. And there was other things, when you're in school you run across, but that was one subject I still can remember all these years. Pint a pound the world around. And of course, although it was just a small school and small village, I had 2 good friends, Flora Talilak. She was a year younger than I was, but we shared everything together, we're very close friends. But then as we grew up, she got married and moved to Anchorage, and she didn't live too long. She bore children. Maybe she probably passed away 10, 15 years ago. So we used to correspond until she passed away. Then her husband passed away in not too long ago. But we were friends for all those years. And then there was another good friend of mine, which was a distant relative. Her name was Esther Kalirak, and she lives now in Anchorage. I hardly see her, but once a year I think I see her. When I go to Anchorage and go to this same church. You know, it's good to be in contact with your friends. I know I should be more so, but just lack of down to it. Then for our pastime, we girls, we were about 12, 13 by then. We would play horseshoe outside the store there on the road. Of course, in evenings, then cars weren't traveling. We played horseshoe and got tired of that. Then we'd play hopscotch. Right on the road, we make squares and did the horseshoe. Then also, our games were on Sunday afternoon or some afternoon when people weren't busy, doing chores and stuff. The young married couples or even single boys, young men and women, they would play diamond baseball. And it included Ruth, my older sister, Uncle Pete and his wife, and other people there in this small village of Galvin. They'd play diamond baseball and, with sides. But it was, I don't think they have all the rules that the professional play baseball. And when they didn't play baseball, then they would play football. And they had goals too, like the professionals do, but there would be only, who was playing, and they also took sides. And the first one to kick the ball or bring it, we did all the kicking, we didn't run with it. You kicked it and till we hit our goal. And it went on, I don't know how long they would play, until they got tired, I suppose. And who got more points, they'd be the winner. It was mostly for, pass the time. And so then, that was all the games we played. And we also played Manna Manna. We had a circle, 2 circles. And there's 2 teams again, so many in each circle, and there was a jailhouse. And if one side of the team tried to go around our circle where we're at, we would run after them. If we tagged them, then we put them in jail in this little round circle. They had to stay there until somebody from the other team come to them and tag them and bring them back. I think that's the way Manna Manna was played. That's how we did all our exercise. I remember after berry picking all day, and when we got our second breath in the evening, our mothers or grandmothers, they would, I thought you girls were tired. But after we ate supper and, we were all ready to go again. Yeah, those were fun days. There was nothing else going on. No movies. A lot of things that our young people are doing today. There was no hangout place. Of course, in my family, we had to be home by summertime. It didn't matter so much, but wintertime, when we were in school, we had to be home by 9 o'clock. And also summertime, especially when Mom and Papa had boarders to cook for in the morning. I was too young for that job, so the older ones had, like Ruth and Clara, they would have to, get their rest to be able to cook breakfast and have breakfast for the men our boarders, at 8 o'clock. I don't know if they went to work at 8 or went to work at 9, but they had to be fed probably by 7. That was our lifestyle there at Solomon. When I was younger or a teenager, I remember having a very special dog, pure white, and I didn't have him for very long though. It was a female, and I must have had it for a year. And then when we went squirrel hunting in the fall time, I took her along, and she had learned, learned to leave the traps alone, or if I caught a squirrel, she would run up, but of course it took training to have her leave it alone. You know how animals are, any moving thing they want to run over and run after and bite, chew them up. But she was well trained by the time that squirrel hunting season was over. And that winter, when Uncle Pete went to Nome with a team, he took her along, pure white dog. And when he came back, he didn't have her with him. And he told me that she got loose and ran off. And I was heartbroken because I had really gotten attached to that young dog. And then, after I got married and we moved here in Golovin, we had a black Labrador female, and we had her for a while. So when we went squirrel hunting to the Fisher Flats by plane and landed on the natural airport up there, Old Miloc Airport, where the aqua cabin is, and we stayed in that aqua cabin, and Coke and I had gone up there. We went up there several years in a row, and we would take that black lab, which the owners where we got it from had already named Pinky, but we kept her name and didn't change it because she was already used to Pinky. So she was really trained again. Of course, labs are hunters, and she, when I took her with me, she also learned to leave the traps alone. And they're good too, because if there's a hole and there's squirrels in there, they'd smell, and they'd smell the hole, and you will really know that when they linger there that there's some squirrels in that den. So we'd set traps in that den. Then one time I was walking, and lo and behold, I don't know where she got this squirrel. It was already, cooled off. She brought it to me and dropped it. So I examined it. It might have been what I dropped the day before. She was well trained too, but somehow or another she got sick and we lost her. But when I was younger, when I was still at home in Solomon, fall time, I had caught a very young squirrel, and it was hardly damaged, in the trap. So I decided to take it home as a pet. So when I brought it home, I put it in the dark room of the store and made a grass, put it in a box and with a grass bedding. And it hibernated that winter, and then when the springtime came, we started hearing it chirping. But poor squirrel, I wasn't aware of their lice. She was just loaded with lice. I don't know, for some reasons. I think not too long after she hibernated, maybe she wasn't eating the food they're used to on a hillside, up in the hills where they grow up and live there. I went to check it, and it was dead. So I never tried having a squirrel pet after that. 1945. We were living in I grew up in Solomon, was still living in Solomon. So Uncle Pete asked me to come along with his wife Clara and 2 kids to come to Golovin and by dog team for Easter. So we came to Gullivan, where I was born, to Minnie and John Fagerstrom. And so while we were here, I was maybe 18, 19 years old. So I went to visit my aunt, Catherine Olson, who was my biological father's sister. And while I was there, her husband, John Olson, showed me his nephew's picture. He was now in the Navy. He was in his uniform, Navy uniform. So then years went by, and another time, years later, 1950, I'm sure it was, somewhere of 50, when I was in Nome, getting ready to, waiting to come to Gullivan, Pan Am at the time was flying, and my grandfather running a roadhouse, I knew these road commission's crew pretty well, and Emmons was his name, and their daughter had just turned 1, so they invited me to have a birthday party for their oldest daughter. So when the birthday party was over, since he worked for the road crew, Mr. Emmons, he was going to meet Pan Am because they had meat coming for the crew down between Solomon and Council in Fox River. So I said, I'll go with you. So he took me out I rode with him to the airport. He picked them meat that was coming in, and I was sitting in a car, and here comes a young man, and I recognize him. That's Martin Olson. And my two sisters, Doris and Myrtle, kept talking about, after so many years, Martin is finally coming back. So I recognized him from that picture John Olson, his uncle, had showed me. So I thought to myself, well, I'll surprise those girls. I saw Martin Olson first the next day when I see them. So I got out of the car. He had already entered into the lobby there. I went in and introduced myself. I'm Maggie Kern from Solomon, and you're Martin Olson. He said, yeah. Not thinking of anything. I just wanted to tell those sisters of mine because they kept talking about him coming back in so many years after he went to school in Spartan, and then before he finished the school there, he didn't want to be drafted to the Army. He joined the Navy. So when he got done under the GI Bill, he finished his schooling and became an aircraft mechanic, and also got his flying commercial pilot license. So when the weather was bad because we hadn't come to Gullivan yet, so he was on the same flight to Gullivan here with my family, my sister and Doris, two of my sisters, and Fred Chambers, my brother-in-law. Martin and I were in the same flight and came down here, where he grew up and where my two sisters grew up, Myrtle and Doris. They knew him well. So while we were here, in I don't know how many days, love blossomed. So he asked me to marry him. Naturally, I had to write a Dear John to this one guy I was engaged to at the time. It's not a laughing matter, but and I had told Martin, I'm already engaged. He said, well, write him a Dear John, and I've never heard of a Dear John before. So I did. And then we got engaged, and he was on his way up to North Slope to work on the pipeline up there. That was when it was just starting. Got engaged, and we didn't get married till 1952. We got married there in Solomon. I think it was the first wedding there at the BIA school. which has now been turned into a bread and breakfast there where I went to school. It was built probably in late 30s. And not too long ago, then there was a second wedding, probably 2 years ago. Brian James from Nome and his wife got married there. I'm sorry I didn't make it to the wedding because it was the only 2 marriages I've heard of in that BIA school since Martin and I got married in 1952. And he was now then flying down in Bethel for Alaska Airlines when Alaska Airlines had commuter planes down the Bethel area, also in Nome. And we went down there for a month, and he was transferred to Nome, and we lived in Nome that winter. And he worked as a mechanic there in Nome under Alaska Airlines. And so I got pregnant right away, and Donnie was born in Nome, 1953, Donald. Then in 1955 we had another son, and we named him Martin Olson Jr. But my family, my aunt, Uncle Pete's wife, nicknamed him Coke, and we knew him as Coke all those years, ever since he was just a little boy, spelt K-O-K-E. Then in 1956 we had another little boy, and he was David K. Olson, David Kenneth Olson. But since he was lighter than the rest, his dad used to call him my little Eskimo man. And when we would ask him when he was just learning to talk, "What's your name?" he came out himself with M.O. So that stuck. So his nickname was M.O. But his real name was David K. Olson. Then so in 1959 we had another baby, a little girl. She was 8 pounds and 12 ounces, I think. A bouncing baby girl. She outweighed all her brothers by a little over maybe a pound. And we named her Margaret Mary Olson. Margaret was my aunt on my father's side, Margaret Cox, that lived in California. And Martin had a twin sister which had died at 8 months. Her name was Mary. So we named her after Martin's twin sister Mary. And that was the only children we had, was the 3 of the 4. Then after 8 years living in Nome and Martin flying for Bill Munns, we moved here to Golovin, 1960. July 31st, the last day of July. And Martin had bought out loft and the buildings of Lohman Commercial Company, which they had from the beginning of the century. They had a reindeer plant down by Island, and they had a store here. And of course, it was the Lohman Lightridge Company too. So he bought their lots, the one where our house is now sitting, I'm living in, and the point where they had their tugboats, as they used as a yard for their tugboats and the barges when they pulled them out. And we started up a little store. And so when the boys got older, you know, their dad being a pilot, of course all of them wanted to become a pilot, because that was the only transportation other than, and there was no snow machine when we first came, maybe not till early part of the 60s, where people started carrying, the stores starts dealing with snow machines. And still at that time, people were still using dog team, but it was no longer was in demand since the snow machine came. And living here with no road system, the boys wanted to learn to fly, so they all learned to fly, Donnie, Coke, and M.O. And then They were all pilots by the time. I think in 76 they all flew. But in 1976, our first death in the family was Martin Jr. He had gone to Nome that Monday morning to pick up a passenger, gone to Nome, and then on his way back he was picking up a young boy from here that had spent the weekend at Council. And when he was landing into Council, I really don't know what happened. He had a crash by the North Star Airport, coming into North Star Airport. And in the impact, the plane burst into flame. And of course then it was fishing season, and I was real busy in the store, and I had closed for lunch hour, and I was in the porch getting something ready for lunch. The flying service agent came down and told me that a red and white plane had crashed in Council. Bill Laws had sent the message to this couple that were agents. And right away when she said red and white plane, I knew it was Coke, and my first words out were Coke. And Martin was working behind the spit where he had the landing craft parked. I went back there with a three-wheeler at the time. We had three-wheelers then, not four-wheelers. And I went to give him the message that the agent by Nome Flying Service had given me word that a red and white plane crashed in Council, coming into land. So he said, tell Dan Showbloom, who was staying with us at the time, to gas up the plane. And I told him, I'll go with you. So I came on home, and then he came on home too. So we got in the plane and flew to Council. And on our way, I remember this lady, previous to this, had lost 4 sons to airplane crashes. Her name was Clara. I remembered her and other friends I knew that had lost loved ones in plane crashes. And we looked at we flew over Melson Quick Airport. There was no plane there. Then we headed for North Star, and there it was still smoldering. And people standing around it, looking at us as we flew and to land at the North Star Airport. And that was, Martin's first words were, that's what we were always afraid of. So I stayed at the airport while he and other men walked up to the crash site. And when he came back, he said, he's burned beyond recognition. So, of course, the troopers then, or the rescuers, took the body and sent it into Anchorage for autopsy. Then we came home, and my family came and, of course, gave their condolences. The first verse that came to me was what King David said when his son with Bathsheba had died. You know, he was mourning in ashes and sackcloth. He said, or he cleaned up himself, and when the servants thought that he would really, be mourning, instead he cleaned up himself and dressed himself. And the servants said, were, surprised. and he told his servants, "He can't come to me, but I can go to him." And that verse was the one that really strengthened me, knowing that I'll never see hope here on earth again, but, I can go to him. Then 4 years later, Martin had flew me into Nome. I think it was 28th of November. I was on the ACAC board for the Covenant Church, and I was going down for their annual fall-time meeting. Martin flew me into Nome. I caught Alaska Airlines, and then from Nome he went up to Shishmaref to pick up a load of reindeer meat. And on his way back, the storm hit. And I remember that evening in Anchorage, I asked my sister, I haven't seen one of her daughters for a while. So she drove me over there, and we visit to see Ruthie, her daughter. And while we were there, my niece from Nome was there, and she said, my parents, Minnie and John, had left for Nome, and they barely landed, I think, on Alaska Airlines in Nome Airport. The weather was so bad. And when she said that, it seems my heart just flipped, remembering Martin. I wonder if Martin is caught in the storm. So after we visited Ruthie, Ruth and I went home. Her mom was Ruth too. And when we went home and walked in, Chuck said to me, "Your kids called, they want you to call back." So I called, got on the phone and called them, and one of them told me it was either his sister, I think, or M.O. Dad didn't make it back. So that meant that, he was in an accident. So that night when we went to bed, I hardly slept. I don't think I slept a wink. It seems part of me was gone. And so next morning we made reservations for me to come back home. And Ruth, my sister, came along with me. And the weather was still bad in Nome when we landed, but Boyack was on his way down from Nome to probably Inupiaq, Ryanair. He flew me and John and Catherine down, and Ruth. And that's when they started searching. They search and rescue gave up after 2 weeks of searching, but my boys and Emmo and Donnie came up. He was at med school. He came home, and him and Emmo started search for I don't know how long. Then they also gave up because it was now short days and sort of severe weather. And our friends from Shaktoolik called and told me they're sorry, but they're going to Anchorage for their daughter's wedding, and they won't be over if they found the body, if we have funeral for Martin, that they're sorry they won't be here. But then his wife gave me a verse from Jeremiah 33:3, which says, "Call upon me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things that thou knowest not." And that was the verse that I took for Martin. In life, We don't know the mysteries or what's all beyond in God's realm. And that verse seemed to just fit Martin. So that's the verse I've had for him all these years. And while he was missing, of course, I would hardly sleep, or I would stay up as long as I can so I can sleep longer. But every morning around 4 o'clock, 4:30, I'd wake up and can't go back to sleep. Wondering, and imagining all kinds of things with Martin out there. And the song that came mostly to my mind was "Have Thine Own Way, Lord. Have Thine Own way, Lord, have Thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after Thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still." But the last verse would be the one that really stand out. Have Thine own way, Lord, have Thine own way. Hold o'er my being, absolute sway. Filled with Thy Spirit, till all shall see Christ only always living in me. I think that was the verse that I really treasured, that through this ordeal I went through, that I would be a witness to the people around me, especially Christ only always living in me, who gave me the strength during that time not to give up, that He was still on the throne and watching over us. I think my biggest fear was, here we had a store, a business running a store, an airline, and he was also in a barge business with a landing craft. Summertime, he would haul groceries and, of course, hauled our oil in drums at that time, gas and oil, and our groceries. And losing him, it seems, who was my provider, protector, and also a lover. That was the hardest thing. It seems my castle had collapsed when he was missing. And he was missing from November the 28th, 1980, and he was found by a pilot that was flying in back to Fairbanks from Nome, on one of the hillsides northwest of Shaktoolik, and that was in July. So when he reported he found the aircraft, MO went with a chopper to identify it and make sure it was his plane. And because of their load of reindeer meat in the springtime, when the bears and animals came out, they, of course, ate all the meat there, and including his body. But all down through the years since then, God has given me and my family strength to carry on. So then Mo took over the business. And Sister and I, we continued, the daily business. With Mo's help, he became the manager. And after 13 years, we lost Mo. January 18th, 1993. That was another big loss. Now, to me, a son, first of all, a friend and a business partner was gone. And those were the trying days. And for Carol, I picked out the verse, Psalm 68:5, where it says, "Father to the fatherless and a defender to the widow is God in his inhabitants up in heaven." Similar to that. So, to have God's word when you lose a loved one, it really sustains you. So, it's been a trying years, but like Job said, though he slay me, will I trust in him. In life you need to, if you're overcome with so many problems and sorrows, you need to take time off and start counting your blessings. Because at the end, you will always come up on top because of God's grace.